I never thought a haircut could break a family, but here we are. Let me start from the beginning because, honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of how everything spiraled so fast. Last Thursday, I picked up my 8-year-old stepson, Danny, from his mom's house, like I always do after school. The moment he climbed into the car, I knew something was off. Normally, he would burst in full of energy and chatter about his latest Lego build or a soccer goal, but this time he slumped into the seat with his baseball cap pulled so low it nearly covered his eyes. When he finally looked up, I saw why. The curls he'd been growing out for months to achieve that cool mullet he'd begged for had been hacked off unevenly above his ears. He'd been so proud of his hair, and now he looked as if someone had taken garden shears to it. I asked him what happened, but he only burst into big, hiccuping sobs that made my chest hurt. When we got home, I texted his mom, Karen, and about half an hour later she replied that Jess had taken him to get gum out of his hair, and that it was just hair, it would grow back. Jess is Karen's girlfriend, and they've been together for about a year, which I'd been okay with, until now. Later that night, after Greg, my husband, and Danny's dad got home, I overheard Danny in the kitchen whispering to him. He mumbled that Jess had told him his curls looked shabby and hinted that boys shouldn't care about looking pretty. Greg tried to reassure him, but I stood frozen in the hallway with my hands clenched. The next morning, I drove to Karen's. When Jess answered the door, I kept my voice steady as I asked why she hadn't called me first. After all, I work at a salon and could have fixed the gum without ruining his hair. She simply replied that I wasn't his mom and that the custody agreement meant I didn't have a say. It felt like she had slapped me. In a burst of anger, I retorted that she was the one responsible for undermining our family by being with Karen while she was still married to Greg, and that she should really stay in her lane. The second those words left my mouth, I regretted them. Not because they weren't true, but because Danny was sitting on the stairs, listening. Jess then threatened to take the matter to court and try to revoke my visitation, claiming I was unstable. When I told Greg, he just sighed and warned me not to make waves because Jess was protective, insisting it wasn't worth the fight. I really wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue. That night, I found Danny in the bathroom, practicing smiles in the mirror. He would tilt his head, force a grin, and then his expression would collapse when he saw the jagged ends of his hair. He didn't notice that I was watching, and I made sure he never saw me cry. Things only got worse from there. Danny's teacher emailed me because he had been refusing to take off his hat in class, even during gym. When I brought it up to Greg, he suggested that we try family therapy with Karen and Jess to smooth things over, but I refused. Jess had already started referring to herself as Mom's Jess around Danny, subtly pushing him to adopt that title like it was something to be proud of. A week later, I found a crumpled birthday party invitation in his backpack that didn't include my name at all. Greg claimed that Jess believed my presence would only confuse Danny. I eventually confronted Karen directly, and we met at a coffee shop. For a fleeting moment, she looked like the friend I'd known before the divorce. Then she explained that Jess felt threatened because I was the one Danny often drew in his notebooks and the one he begged to take him to the park. Apparently, Jess just wanted him to recognize her as part of his family too. When I asked if that meant erasing my place in his life, she didn't answer. Greg later accused me of caring more about my own pride than about Danny's well-being. He asked why I couldn't just be the bigger person, as if I were the one who had somehow taken scissors to a kid's self-esteem. That night, I flipped through Danny's sketchbook that he had left on the couch. Most of the pages were filled with drawings of dinosaurs, soccer balls, and stick figure sketches of us at the zoo. But the last few pages had been torn out, leaving only jagged edges behind. When I asked him about it, he simply shrugged and said he thought they were too messy. However, the scraps I later found in the trash told a different story. A half-drawn image of Danny and me holding hands that had been ripped right down the middle. I don't know what happens next. All I can say is that Danny's smiles now feel forced, and his drawings are in pieces, while the man I love thinks I should apologize just for caring. I'm caught between fighting for the kid who calls me Steph instead of Mom, and risking the loss of the family I thought we'd built. The only thing I'm sure of is that while hair grows back, trust doesn't. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. I guess I just needed to tell someone who isn't already picking sides. Now, for the first update. 3 weeks. That's how long it's been since I posted here about Danny's haircut and the whole mess with Jess. I wish I could say things got better, but honestly, it feels like we're all just free-falling. Let me start with the court papers. Jess actually followed through on her threat. Last Monday, I got served with a formal complaint that accused me of undermining parental authority because I took Danny to get a trim after the whole gum incident. I mean, a trim. The very same kid who had been crying every time he caught a glimpse of his reflection. Greg pleaded with me to apologize, arguing that if I admitted I'd overstepped, maybe Jess would drop it. But how do you apologize for caring? I told him no, knowing that if I backed down now, Jess would keep pushing until I wasn't even allowed to pick Danny up from school. Danny's been wetting the bed again. He hadn't done that since he was 5, right after Karen and Greg split. The first time it happened, I quickly stripped his sheets while he stood in the doorway. His shoulders slumped as if he'd committed some unspeakable crime. I tried to reassure him that it was okay and that accidents happen, but he just insisted he was too old for this. I wanted nothing more than to scoop him up in a big hug and scream into the void, but instead, I ended up making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. He ate them quietly, and I pretended not to notice him discreetly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then, out of the blue at the grocery store, Karen's neighbor, Mrs. Pena, slipped me a note. She's this tiny, no-nonsense lady who's been next door to Karen for over a decade. The note mentioned that she had seen Jess in a heated argument with another woman outside the salon where she works, with talk about a refund, and the other woman looking dangerously close to losing control. I wasn't sure what to do with that at first, but I started looking into it. It turned out that Jess had been fired from 2 salons before this one. The records might have been sealed, but the gossip certainly wasn't. One stylist at work muttered that Jess had a reputation for creating drama and cutting corners. Then, unexpectedly, Greg's ex-mother-in-law, Karen's mom, called me. She's never been exactly on my side, and during the call, she claimed that Jess was like a tornado, and that Karen was too lovesick to see what was really going on. Hearing that from someone who once told me I'd never be Danny's real stepmom shook me more than I can say. The worst moment, though, happened during homework time. Danny looked up at me with a question about whether he'd still be taken to soccer if Jess forbade me from seeing him. I couldn't decide whether I should just pull him into a hug or vent my frustration in some other way. In the end, I managed to promise him that nothing would keep me from being there for him, even though my voice wavered. He simply nodded, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Not long after that, I discovered a receipt showing that Greg had withdrawn $1,200 in cash, purportedly for a family mediator. When I asked him about it, he hesitated noticeably before claiming it was for Danny's therapy, even though Danny's therapy was already covered by insurance. Greg wouldn't meet my eyes, and I decided not to push the issue. What's the point when you can tell you're being lied to? I did something pretty foolish next. I reached out to one of Jess's former coworkers on LinkedIn. I remembered that she had left a vague review about toxic work environments, so I thought I might get some answers. We arranged to meet at a cafe, but she never showed up. I ended up sitting there for an hour with a cold latte, feeling more like a stalker than anything else. When I finally got home, I found Greg in the guest room. He'd moved his clothes there that morning, explaining that he needed some space from all the drama. And to top it off, he had even bought new pillows for the guest bed. More than one set, actually. Danny's school counselor called me in soon after. Apparently, his file now included a note about his exposure to adult conflicts, along with a recommendation to reduce the tension at home. I nearly laughed because tension pretty much defined our home anyway. Greg and I tiptoed around one another, and Danny was constantly trying to avoid making waves between us. Then last week, Karen showed up at my job. I work reception at a salon, and she stormed in like she owned the place, demanding that I stop prying into Jess's life. I reminded her that I wasn't the one who had put gum in Danny's hair, and she left without even buying the shampoo she'd pretended to want. Later, when I dropped off Danny's backpack, I noticed that the family photos in their hallway had changed. The pictures of me and Danny at the pumpkin patch had been tucked away, replaced by glossy snapshots of Karen, Jess, and Danny at the beach. Even Danny's smile looked unnaturally polished, almost as if it had been edited. Last night during movie night, Danny handed me a crumpled note. In wobbly letters, he had written that he wanted his curls back. I didn't start crying immediately, but by the time he fell asleep in my lap with his uneven hair tickling my arm, the tears were coming freely. I still have no idea what comes next. Jess is like an untamable storm. Greg has turned into a stranger living in the same house, and Danny is caught right in the middle, trying so hard to be brave. All I know is that I can't stop fighting, even if it means risking everything else. Thanks for letting me vent. It really does help knowing someone's listening. Now for the second update. 2 months. That's how long it's been since Jess filed the first court petition, and I still wake up some mornings feeling like I'm strapped to a roller coaster I never bought a ticket for, the kind where the safety bar is broken and all you can do is white-knuckle the seat and hope you don't fly out. The court proceedings moved forward faster than I expected. My lawyer warned me that judges tend to side with biological parents in blended family cases, which felt like a gut punch. It was as if all those weekends teaching Danny to ride a bike and staying up with him during nightmares didn't count because I wasn't considered his real mom. Greg tried to soften the blow by explaining that Jess had pressured Karen into filing the petition, implying that I was trying to replace her. But how can you replace someone who is actively trying to erase your existence? Danny's teacher called me last week. His grades had been slipping, but the worst part was when she found him crying in the bathroom, murmuring that he had messed up his family. When she explained what had happened, I had to sit down. My first thought was that Jess must have said something, a careless remark placing blame on me. Yet when I asked Danny about it, he merely shrugged and mentioned that his stomach hurt. Kids really shouldn't carry that kind of guilt. Then, at the grocery store, a woman in the produce aisle kept staring at me. I recognized her vaguely, maybe as a client from the salon, but I couldn't place her exactly. As I reached for a bunch of bananas, she approached and muttered a warning about watching my back while accusing Jess of lying to keep clients. Before I knew it, she was gone, leaving me clutching the bananas, feeling foolish. Later, I learned that she had been one of Jess's old clients. Bit by bit, things began to click into place. The sealed employment records, the heated arguments Mrs. Pena had mentioned. After 3 days and a bottle of wine, I finally connected with Marisol, Jess's former coworker who had ghosted me at the cafe. I discovered that Jess had been fired from her last job for deliberately altering a bride's highlights the night before her wedding, after the bride had complained about a booking fee. Marisol described it as sabotage, explaining that Jess was all about control, and if she couldn't have something, she would destroy everything. Armed with that information, I confronted Karen, which turned out to be a big mistake. She accused me of being jealous and of obsessing over Jess instead of focusing on Danny. I felt the urge to shout that she was letting Jess isolate her, but by the time I got home, Karen had already blocked my number. Greg later found Marisol's written statement in my desk drawer and immediately panicked, waving the paper as if it were a live grenade. He kept insisting that I was making everything worse. When I asked him what he expected me to do, whether I should just roll over and let Jess steamroll us, he said nothing and simply left the room. I even heard the guest room door click shut again. The next morning, Danny handed me a drawing. In it, he depicted Jess as a witch with scissors in hand, cutting off his curls while he cried. Beneath the picture, in shaky handwriting, he explained that Jess now thought he was ugly. My heart shattered at that sight. When Karen saw the drawing, she dismissed it as concerning and blamed me for planting such ideas in his head, as if an 8-year-old's pain were nothing more than a flight of fancy. Then a cease and desist letter arrived. Jess's lawyer accused me of defamation for speaking with Marisol. Although my lawyer brushed it off as a bluff, the letter still felt like a threat, as if Jess were implying she could reach me anywhere. The most surprising part came when my lawyer unearthed a restraining order against Jess from a former partner. Although it dated back years and was unrelated to the custody case, it revealed a disturbing pattern. I could see the shock on Greg's face, pale as though he had seen a ghost. He tried to reassure me that Jess had never been physically abusive toward Danny, but his words barely convinced me, and it seemed he was mostly trying to comfort himself. Later, Greg's sister Mia sent me a photo via text. It showed Jess at a family barbecue, yelling at Danny's cousin for spilling juice, with a caption that accused her of being a waste of space, hardly acceptable behavior. I showed the photo to Greg, who simply rubbed his temples and remarked that Karen was under Jess's spell, as if that somehow explained everything. In that moment, it felt like we were all just caught up in Jess's twisted fairy tale. The breaking point came when Danny pleaded with me to take him to the salon. Jess had forbidden it, claiming I was unqualified, yet his hair still looked uneven and forced him to hide under hats. So I defied the rules and sneaked him in after hours. My coworker Lena managed to even out his hair while he excitedly talked about his soccer drills. When he saw himself in the mirror, he grinned, truly grinned for the first time in weeks, and even wondered if we could dye his hair blue next time, a thought that made me laugh until I cried. Naturally, Jess noticed the trim and reported me to the custody mediator for what she called defiance. Although the mediator reprimanded me for being reckless, she couldn't ignore the fact that Danny seemed noticeably lighter and happier. A small victory, I suppose. Later, Greg pulled me aside, looking completely exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in months. In a barely audible whisper, he admitted that he was scared of her and felt that Karen was too deeply entangled with Jess for him to pull her out. For a moment, I saw the man I had married, overwhelmed by fear, and then he suggested that perhaps we should just play along, letting the moment dissolve. I don't know what happens next. With the court date looming, Jess continuously twisting the knife, and Danny trying so hard to be okay, I only know that when he showed up last weekend wearing a hat I had bought him and grinned as if he'd won the lottery, I was ready to do it all again. Every stupid, reckless, necessary thing. I appreciate having the chance to get this off my chest. Sometimes it feels like I'm screaming into a void, though at least that void never serves court papers. Now for the final update. 2 months. That's how long it had been since Jess filed the first court petition, and some mornings I still wake up feeling as though I'm strapped to a roller coaster I never bought a ticket for, the kind where the safety bar is broken and all you can do is white-knuckle the seat and hope you don't fly out. The court date arrived on a Tuesday. Jess showed up in a sharp, tailored suit, as if she were auditioning for Law and Order, smirking every time Karen glanced her way. When Karen took the stand, her voice wavered just enough for me to tell she'd rehearsed her lines. She claimed that Jess disrespected boundaries and that Danny was confused because of her. I kept my eyes on Danny's drawings that my lawyer had blown up as exhibits. His jagged self-portraits in hats and the witch with scissors. The judge's face gave nothing away, but when Jess's ex-client testified remotely about how she had sabotaged that bride's hair, I saw him lean forward. Jess's lawyer objected, but it was too late and the tone shifted. When the judge dismissed her petition, calling it overreach, I didn't cheer. I just stared at the wood grain of the bench in front of me, counting the knots until it felt real. Greg hugged me afterward, stiff at first, then tighter. It was the first time he had touched me in months that didn't feel like an apology. Jess's downfall happened fast. The ex-client's testimony was shared in local mom groups, and then the salon owner let her go. By the weekend, her Instagram was scrubbed clean, and someone had tagged her in a post about the bride's botched wedding hair. Karma is a bitch with a highlights chart, I guess. Danny started FaceTiming me every night, twisting his fingers through his curls, now past his ears, grinning as if he'd discovered a secret. He pointed out that his hair was now in waves, pressing his face close to the camera. I didn't have the heart to tell him it was more frizz than ringlet. It didn't matter, especially since he had stopped wearing hats. Greg and I started couples therapy. The first session was mostly silence, with him picking at a thread on his sleeve while I mentally listed every time he had chosen peace over us. Then he admitted that he had thought if he kept his head down, she would stop, not realizing that stopping her had become his responsibility too. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Karen left Jess 3 weeks after the court ruling. She showed up at our door with no makeup, holding a Ziploc bag of Danny's Legos as a peace offering. She explained that she had found texts in which Jess had flirted with a client for free upgrades and admitted that she had allowed herself to be diminished by it. I wanted to hate her, but she looked so tired, as if she'd been hollowed out, so I accepted the Legos. Danny's birthday party was at a trampoline park. The invitation had my name scribbled in crayon next to Greg's. Jess wasn't there. Karen came and hovered near the snack table until Danny dragged her into a dodgeball game. Watching her laugh as a foam ball smacked her shoulder, I wondered how long it had been since she had let someone else take the hit. I ran into Jess at a gas station last week. She was leaning against a car with a chipped Supercuts logo on the door, her hair now a dishwater blonde with frayed ends. We locked eyes for a second, long enough for me to see not only anger but also panic, the kind that comes when you realize your armor is nothing more than cardboard. She looked away first. Danny's teacher emailed again, this time including a photo of him leading his class in a science project, his hands waving wildly as he explained something about volcanoes. His hair was a mess, and the caption noted that he had insisted everyone notice his cool curls that day. On a random Thursday, I received a card from Greg's ex-mother-in-law. The front showed a sunset, and inside was a note acknowledging that I had fought for him when she couldn't. There was no signature. I slid the card into Danny's baby book, placing it right next to his hospital bracelet. Last night, Danny handed me a new drawing, a picture of us holding hands, with his hair drawn as a swirl of yellow crayon and the word love floating above us in bubble letters. He had stuck it on the fridge before bed, right over the spot where Jess's cease and desist letter had once hung. Greg noticed me staring at the drawing, and without saying anything at first, rested his chin on my shoulder. We stood there until the fridge hummed to life, and then he softly asked if we were okay. I didn't answer. Later, when Danny toddled in asking for a sleepover in our room, we all ended up on the couch with our limbs tangled and a cartoon about talking dogs playing softly in the background. There were no hats and there were no tears. I don't know if happily ever after exists outside of Danny's drawings, but for now the roller coaster has stopped. We're still shaky, still checking the safety bar, but we're here.